The first light of June 1944 crept slowly across the horizon of Kyushu, turning the mist into a thin golden veil that curled around hangars, watchtowers, and rows of weary aircraft. A faint wind brushed across the tarmac, carrying with it the salt of the nearby sea and the metallic tang of aviation fuel. At this fragile hour, when night surrendered reluctantly to day, Japan's war machine stirred to life with rituals that had once felt confident, even invincible. Mechanics crouched beneath the bellies of their fighters, tightening bolts by touch, listening to the familiar rattle of tools. Pilots moved with disciplined calm, their footsteps soft on the dew-soaked ground. This was how mornings had begun for 3 long years of war. With certainty, with routine, with the assumption that the sky above Japan belonged to Japan. But on this morning the world felt wrong. Even the birds seemed unusually quiet. Even the air felt expectant, as though holding its breath. Then came the sound. At first it was a distant murmur, too steady to be thunder, too deep to be any aircraft Japan had ever known. It rolled across the sky like a tide, gathering force, vibration, and presence. Heads turned. Veterans frowned. Officers reached instinctively for binoculars. And then they saw them. High, far higher than reconnaissance planes flew, higher than the highest intercept drills, higher even than the limits printed in Japanese flight manuals, small silver shapes glinted in the early sun. They seemed unreal, like ghosts drifting in the thin blue air. A young pilot, squinting upward, finally broke the silence. "Captain, what altitude is that?" The officer beside him didn't answer. Because the truth was impossible. The truth was humiliating. The truth signaled a new kind of war. The Americans had arrived in the form of the B-29 Superfortress, flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could not reach. A simple contradiction shattered everything Japanese commanders believed. Japan's aviation doctrine was based on reach, agility, and the courage of the individual pilot. Yet here were enemy aircraft flying in a realm physically beyond reach, immune to interception, indifferent to defense. That contradiction, the shock of seeing the enemy yet being powerless to touch him, became the defining emotional and strategic tension of the war's final year. The morning's confusion was only the beginning. Communications centers across western Japan erupted in frantic activity. Radar operators tracked the intruders with disbelief. Officers checked and rechecked altitude reports, convinced that the instruments must be flawed. Interceptor squadrons scrambled anyway, engines screaming, pilots pushing machines to the limits of physics. But as the Zeros, Ki-43s and Ki-44s clawed upward through the thinning air, their engines began to cough. Power faded. Controls stiffened. Airframes shuddered. The American bombers sailed far above them, unbothered, untouched, untouchable. The Japanese pilots might as well have been chasing the moon. Down below, the irony burned. For years, Japan had dominated the sky with maneuverability. Now the Americans dominated it with altitude. This was not merely a military gap. It was a philosophical one. Japan's war doctrine valued the individual warrior, the pilot who could outfly, outthink, or outfight his adversary. America's doctrine, slowly forged through industrial might, valued machines. Machines that could do what no human could, machines that rendered courage insufficient and tradition obsolete. The B-29 was not simply an aircraft. It was an idea. That technology could climb beyond fear, beyond doctrine, and beyond the limits imposed by the past. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to breathe at 30,000 feet. Its massive Wright R-3350 engines, despite their flaws, could lift the plane higher than any combat aircraft flying the Pacific. Its range, its payload, its precision, all represented a new chapter in warfare. And for Japan, this was the beginning of a nightmare. Because those silver specks in the sky were not just bombers. They were messengers. They carried a message written in aluminum, horsepower, and altitude. The world had changed. Japan had not. Yet the story is bigger than altitude and machinery. It is a story of human belief, how leaders cling to assumptions, how nations place faith in traditions, and how ordinary soldiers bear the weight when those traditions collapse. It is a story of two visions of war, one forged in the age of dogfights and daring, the other crafted in factories, laboratories, and strategic planning rooms thousands of miles away. It is also a story of bitter irony. Japan's early war triumphs had been built on surprise, innovation, and audacity. But by 1944, that spirit had hardened into rigidity. While American engineers fought their own battles with engine failures, fuel logistics, and technical chaos, Japanese industry struggled to adapt, starved of materials, time, and institutional flexibility. So when the B-29 appeared, flying impossibly high, gleaming like slow-moving stars, Japan saw not merely a bomber, but a future it could no longer reach. In the chilly wind at 30,000 feet, the Americans experienced something equally profound. Gazing down from their pressurized cabins, seeing small black bursts of flak explode harmlessly far below, many B-29 crews felt a strange detachment. They were fighting a war at a distance, physically and emotionally, unlike any conflict before. Yet even for them the struggle was real. Engines overheated. Cabin fires were common. Navigation errors sent entire crews into the ocean. The Superfortress was a triumph, yes, but a fragile one held together by innovation, improvisation, courage, and constant repair. Two sides, separated by altitude, were united by exhaustion. Two nations, separated by ideology, were racing toward a climax neither fully understood. The moment those B-29s appeared over Kyushu marked a turning point. Not just the beginning of the bombing campaign against the Japanese mainland, but the beginning of the end of a certain kind of war, where bravery alone could win battles, and where nations could rely on tradition rather than transformation. From this moment forward, warfare belonged to altitude, to industry, to machines designed in peace and perfected in conflict. This documentary begins here, on that quiet morning in June, because this was the instant the sky itself changed sides. And in the end, this story reveals a profound truth about humanity and civilization. When technology rises faster than belief, the world is remade, not by courage but by the heights we dare to reach. In early 1944, the Pacific War was a paradox. Japan, though strained, still held vast stretches of territory. The empire stretched from northern China to the jungles of Burma, from the volcanic Marianas to the lush islands of the East Indies. Yet beneath that surface of grandeur, its industrial core was eroding, quietly, relentlessly. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America operated at a different scale entirely. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the United States had done what no nation in history had accomplished: converted an entire industrial civilization into a war engine. Factories that once produced refrigerators now churned out machine guns. Automobile plants built tanks by the hundreds. Boeing's assembly lines ran 24 hours a day under the glare of white industrial lamps. In Kansas and Washington, the most audacious aviation gamble in history was taking shape: the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a machine so complex that more than 1 million engineering hours had been poured into its creation. But before the B-29 could change the war, it was nearly crushed by its own ambition. A machine born in turmoil. The Wright R-3350 engines overheated so often that test flights became contests of endurance. Mechanics joked that the engines wanted to kill their crews. The aircraft was so large that it required new runways, new hangars, new tools. Crews struggled with pressurization issues and electrical failures. It was a titan, but a temperamental one. Curtis LeMay later remarked, "The B-29 was the finest bomber we had, and the most dangerous to fly." While America wrestled with innovation, Japan wrestled with limits. Japan's fragile doctrine. The Japanese air strategy had been written years earlier, during its campaigns in China, where light, agile fighters like the A6M0 reigned supreme. Maneuverability had been the key to victory, not altitude. Not armor. Not long-range durability. This doctrine brought early success, but it was designed for a different war. By 1944, Japan faced an enemy that was no longer fighting for territory. America was fighting for total victory, powered by factories that produced more aircraft in 6 months than Japan could in 2 years. Cracks in the sky. Japan's aircraft production was hampered by shortages: aluminum, high-octane fuel, ball bearings, rubber. Skilled pilots, trained over 2 years, were being replaced by cadets trained in just 10 weeks. Engines failed often. Airframes aged quickly. Japan's commanders recognized the danger but clung tightly to old beliefs: the warrior spirit, the decisive duel, the supremacy of individual skill. None of them imagined that the next chapter of the war would be fought at altitudes where the human body could not survive without artificial air. The last days before the Superfortress. As spring turned to summer in 1944, radar stations across Asia reported unfamiliar echoes: massive, slow, deep rumbling aircraft practicing long-range flights. Japanese intelligence suspected a new American bomber, but the scale of its altitude and range remained underestimated, even dismissed. In Japanese briefings, officers insisted, "No bomber can fly so high and still carry a meaningful load." They would soon learn that ambition had rewritten physics. The world changed on June 15, 1944, when 75 B-29s launched from bases in China to strike the Hayate steel works on Kyushu. It was the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands since Doolittle's raid 2 years earlier. The flight was long, brutal. Engines overheated. Several aircraft crashed on takeoff. But the mission reached its target, and the Japanese defenders finally confronted the new reality. The first shock, an enemy above the atmosphere of tradition. Japanese fighter squadrons scrambled with urgency and anger. The pilots strained their aircraft, pushing throttles, fighting thin air, but at 30,000 feet their propellers lost bite. Engines wheezed. Exhaust trails flickered. The airframes vibrated dangerously. The B-29s flew serenely above them, gleaming like cold silver islands drifting through the sky. One Japanese pilot later admitted, "We rose toward them until our instruments trembled and our wings shuddered." But the Americans remained as distant as gods. It was not just altitude that stunned the Japanese command. It was the arrogance of physics, a bomber that defied interception. Inside the Superfortress, while Japanese fighters stalled below, B-29 crews worked in a pressurized world, sitting inside a machine far ahead of its time. A fully pressurized cabin system, remote-controlled gun turrets, a central fire control computer, turbo superchargers that forced oxygen into engines, a combat radius of 1,500 miles. The plane could drop bombs with precision from the edge of the stratosphere. It was the physical embodiment of American industry, cold, massive, and efficient. The Marianas, the game-changing chessboard. Everything transformed again after the Battle of the Marianas in mid-1944. The seizure of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam opened the door to Japan's doorstep. From these islands, just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, the B-29s could strike the Japanese mainland at will. Tinian became the largest airbase in the world, with 6 runways carved from coral. More than 500 B-29s were soon stationed across the islands. Japan was now within daily reach of industrial-scale bombing. The war had changed dimension. Altitude gave way to frequency. Frequency gave way to devastation. Japan scrambled to adapt. Designers attempted emergency modifications to fighters, stripping armor, adding high-compression engines, reducing fuel loads. The Ki-84 Hayate and J-2M Raiden showed promise. But production was slow and materials scarce. Pilots launched anyway, aware their machines could barely reach B-29 cruising altitude. Many climbed until their engines failed, then dove back in frustration. Shattered expectations. Japanese commanders faced an unbearable contradiction. They could see the enemy. They could not touch him. Reports flowed in. Cannot reach altitude. Climbing ineffective. B-29s beyond interception. One officer slammed his fist on a wooden table so hard it cracked. If we cannot command the sky, we cannot defend the homeland. The Americans, meanwhile, learned from every sortie. Curtis LeMay, ruthless and calculating, redesigned the entire strategy. When high-altitude daylight precision attacks proved ineffective due to jet streams, he shifted tactics. Low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids. The same aircraft that once floated beyond reach now thundered at 7,000 feet, unleashing firestorms on Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The psychological impact was catastrophic. The night Tokyo became a furnace. On March 9 to 10, 1945, 334 B-29s struck Tokyo in the dead of night. They flew low, fast, and heavy with incendiary bombs that turned neighborhoods into oceans of flame. Civilians described the sky as a burning river. Firestorms generated winds of 100 miles per hour, turning streets into chimneys of heat. Japan realized a brutal truth. The enemy had mastered the sky at both altitude and approach. The inner voices of war. A B-29 navigator wrote, "We watched Tokyo burn from 7,000 feet. It looked like the earth itself was on fire." A Japanese civil defense worker remembered. "The sky roared like a dragon. We could do nothing but run." A young Japanese pilot wrote in his diary, "We chase giants. They do not even notice us." War had become a chasm of experience. One side trapped in obsolescence, the other propelled by innovation. Beyond the machines and missions were the human beings who carried the burdens. American crews. They lived in a world of danger and monotony, long missions, freezing temperatures, constant engine failures. Many B-29s exploded midair. Others ditched in the sea. The Pacific swallowed ships and planes alike. Crewmen slept little. Wrote letters that rarely hid their fear. Glued photos of loved ones inside cramped cabins. A gunner wrote, "We fly above the world, but fear flies with us." Japanese civilians. They endured hunger, air raids, and displacement. Children trained with bamboo spears. Families dug fire trenches. Cities vanished in nights of smoke. A mother from Osaka said, "Every time the air raid siren sounded, I wondered if it would be the night we died." Japanese pilots. Many died in desperate climbs toward unreachable bombers. Others saved their engines for a single pass, hoping a lucky shot might bring down a giant. Their bravery could not overcome physics. By mid-1945, the B-29 campaign had reshaped the Pacific War. 3,970 B-29s built, over 600,000 tons of bombs dropped on Japan, 67 Japanese cities heavily burned, hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties, Japanese aircraft losses, thousands American B-29 crew losses, thousands as well from crashes, flak and night missions. Economically, Japan's industrial output collapsed by 60%. Psychologically, the belief in imperial invincibility evaporated. Strategically, the Americans demonstrated that distance and altitude no longer protected nations. The final act came with two B-29 missions unlike any before, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, carrying weapons that changed history. The aircraft was named Enola Gay. The world entered the nuclear age. The B-29 did more than bomb cities. It redefined what nations believed possible. Japan learned a bitter but transformative lesson. Tradition could not defend against technology. Courage could not climb to 30,000 feet. America learned its own lesson. Even the most powerful technology costs human lives, discipline, and moral weight. In the end, this confrontation was more than a battle of aircraft. It was a clash of philosophies, a collision between industrial modernity and warrior tradition, between innovation and rigidity. And the moment Japanese commanders looked up and realized their fighters could not reach the B-29s, that moment captured the essential truth. The war would now be fought on American terms. In American skies. With American altitude. In the final twilight of the Pacific War, as the fires cooled and the sky over Japan grew quiet once more, a strange silence settled over a nation that had once believed the heavens themselves would shield it. For generations, Japan imagined its islands protected by storm, sea, and spirit, fortified by myth as much as by steel. Yet in the last year of the war, that illusion dissolved at 30,000 feet, where B-29s carved shimmering contrails across a sky the empire could not command. What unfolded in those months was not just strategic defeat. It was a revelation about power, technology, human ambition, and the fragile boundaries between confidence and catastrophe. This is where our story must end, not in the thunder of engines, but in the quiet aftermath, where meaning finally surfaces. A civilization confronts the sky. When the Japanese commanders realized their fighters could not reach the B-29s, the shock was more than tactical. It was existential. For years, Japan's military doctrine rested on the belief that spirit outweighed steel. That a pilot's courage could compensate for industrial limits. That willpower could outrun machinery. But high above the home islands, shimmering like ghosts against the stratosphere, the B-29s carried a message no empire could ignore. In the modern age, courage alone cannot conquer technology. This truth was devastating, because it was undeniable. The altitude, the speed, the pressurized cabins, the analog fire control computers, these were not just tools. They were symbols of a world Japan had not entered, a world powered by engineering, mathematics, mass production, systems, fuel, and scale. When the war ended, Japan would spend decades grappling with this revelation. America's burden and victory's shadow. To the Americans who flew the missions, victory came with its own echoes. They had achieved what no air force in history had ever imagined possible. Crossing oceans, ascending to the edge of the atmosphere, and shaping the fate of nations through industrial flight. But the triumph was shadowed by firestorms, moral weight, and an uncomfortable question. What does it mean for victory to rely on overwhelming technological force? Many airmen returned home carrying a dual burden, pride in their achievement, but also the deep memory of what those missions required. In their letters and memoirs, they spoke of the cold, the altitude, the long hours suspended between life and death, and the haunting knowledge that every bomb released carried unimaginable consequences for civilians below. The American victory reshaped the world. But it also reshaped America's understanding of its own power, revealing that industrial dominance could win wars, but not without ethical scars that would linger for generations. The post-war transformation, learning from defeat. For Japan, defeat became the foundation of rebirth. In the ashes of Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and dozens of other cities, a new Japan began to imagine a different future. What had been lost in the sky was reclaimed on the ground through reinvention. The nation that once believed spiritual purity could replace industrial strength began to embrace the very technologies it had underestimated. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan rebuilt factories, universities, research institutes, laboratories, and industries focused on precision engineering. Ironically, the country that had once been humbled by American aviation would later become one of the world's leaders in electronics, automobiles, optics, robotics, and aeronautical engineering. It was as if the empire's encounter with the B-29, a machine symbolizing unreachable altitude, pushed Japan to reach higher than ever before. This is the moral irony history never forgets. Sometimes the greatest innovation is born not from triumph, but from the hard clarity of defeat. The survivors and their memories. Memory is the quiet residue of history, the part that lingers long after textbooks are written and monuments erected. For the Japanese civilians who survived the raids, the memory was one of fear, fire, and the unsettling realization that the sky itself could betray them. For the commanders, it was the memory of looking upward through binoculars and knowing their defenses were powerless. For the American crews, it was the memory of long flights over endless ocean, the slow turning of bomb bay doors, and the radio chatter crackling through oxygen masks. One B-29 navigator, decades later, recalled the moment he saw Japan for the first time through frost-edged glass. It looked peaceful from up there. You forget, in those moments, what your mission really means. A Japanese radar operator, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "We kept calling the altitude. Higher, higher, too high. No fighter could reach them. The sky had become American." These echoes remind us that the story is not simply about machines or commanders. It is about humans, frightened, determined, unsure, making decisions under the cold weight of history. The legacy, a new definition of war. The B-29 campaign changed more than the Pacific War. It changed how nations think about distance, altitude, industry, technological momentum, and the morality of strategic bombing. It showed that wars were no longer fought merely on land or sea. Battles would rise into the air, beyond the reach of conventional defenses, into a domain where only the most advanced nations could operate. The campaign revealed a new truth. In modern conflict, the battlefield belongs to those who can innovate faster than their enemies can adapt. This principle defined the Cold War, the space race, the jet age, and eventually even the digital world. Japan and the United States, once enemies battling at extreme altitude, would later become allies, sharing technology, science, and economic partnership. The sky that once divided them would eventually connect them. Such reversals remind us that history is not static. Its meaning reshapes with time. A moral reflection, what power truly means. Looking back, the story of B-29s flying beyond Japan's reach is not merely a tale of altitude. It is a meditation on the limits of human belief. Japan believed its spirit was enough. America believed its machines were enough. Both beliefs contain truth, and both contain danger. Because in the end, neither spirit nor machines alone can define a nation's destiny. Only the balance between them can. The B-29 forced the world to confront a darker question. What happens when technology becomes more powerful than the imagination that created it? For all its brilliance, the B-29 campaign also illuminated the consequences of technological supremacy, how easily it can overwhelm, how deeply it can wound, and how urgently it demands responsibility. A final image. In the closing days of the war after Japan's surrender, an American officer stood on a runway in the Marianas and watched a row of B-29s powering down for the last time. The engines, once thunderous, faded into a gentle ticking as the metal cooled. He later wrote, "They looked peaceful, almost innocent. Hard to believe these were the machines that brought an empire to its knees. Peaceful. Innocent. Words too small for what history had witnessed. But that image, a quiet runway and silver aircraft resting under a warm Pacific sun, captures the contradiction at the heart of our story. Weapons become still. Nations change shape. The world moves forward. Only the lessons remain." Closing statement, the universal truth. In the end, the shock of Japanese commanders watching unreachable bombers pass overhead revealed something timeless. Human destiny is shaped at the intersection of imagination and innovation. Those who fail to adapt are humbled. Those who learn rise again. And the sky, once unreachable, becomes not a boundary but a beginning.